Hello, and welcome to Crisis Intervention, Chapter 6. We'll be covering the topics of loss, generally, more broadly, more specifically, some context around death and breakups and loss, economic loss in particular. One of the first things we should probably start with is Kubler-Ross. I'm sure you've seen this, it's made it into pop culture. The stages of grief. Um, there are a few things about stages. They don't necessarily occur in any particular order. They're different for each person. The depth is different for each person. Just kind of an interesting side note. I'm always curious about folks who write theory and how closely their theories mirror some of their own personal experiences. And what's interesting about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she's had a lot of losses in her life. In 1958, she married a fellow medical student from America, moved to the United States. She's from Switzerland, by the way. She became pregnant, and that at the time disqualified her from a residency in pediatrics. Can you imagine? So she took one in psychiatry. She had four miscarriages, finally having a son, Kenneth, and a daughter, Barbara, in the early 1960s, and her husband requested a divorce in 1979. And this is just the scratching of the surface sort of stuff around loss for her. Um, a little bit about the stages. Denial and isolation is usually only temporary defense for the individual. Anger is when the individual recognizes that denial can't continue, and because of the anger, they're very difficult to care for. They have misplaced feelings of rage and envy. Um, they're using their energy and projecting resentment and jealousy. In bargaining, there's hope that the individual can postpone or delay death. They try to negotiate things with a higher power. Depression, of course, dying person begins to understand the certainty of death. They may refuse visitors, become silent, may spend a lot of time grieving, crying. And acceptance, the final stage, comes with peace and understanding that death is approaching. Usually, the person in the fifth stage will want to be left alone. They may not have so many feelings of physical pain. Um, and usually, this stage is described as the end of the dying cycle. Some terms used to discuss loss, just separate these out a little bit. Bereavement is a state involving loss. Grief are the feelings of sorrow, anger, and guilt and confusion. And mourning is the overt expression of grief and usually a response to bereavement. All of these things are culturally influenced. Think about your family and what is normal in terms of how they deal with, celebrate if they have any rituals around the person that they lost. And think about if you've been to other um, either funerals or instances where you've been exposed to other families, other cultures, people different than you, and how they express those feelings. There are some sort of, I guess, quasi universal tasks around mourning where there is the accepting of the reality of loss. And that makes sense because really what we're trying to do is make meaning out of the loss. How we do this is really based on how we're raised, our beliefs, our experiences, and also the degree and depth of connection to the person that was lost. There's this universal experience of pain or grief, of course, adjustment to being without that person, and withdrawing emotional energy from that person and reinvesting it into something else. Of course, all these things are bound by culture, how deaths are mourned, how they're celebrated. In some cultures, death is seen as a very accepted, part of the cycle of life, and it's in some ways more of a celebration. In others, it is very heavy, heartbroken, somber occasions. As far as interventions go on the crisis side, of course, talking about the loss, having them identify feelings, it's important to try to separate out feeling versus thought. You know, just making sure that you're keeping an eye on the cognitive aspect versus the emotional aspect. Um, and it's not unusual for survivors without the deceased to it's not unusual to look for major changes, a move or something like that. And I think one of the things the book points out is that it's important to try to help them sort of settle for a little bit before making these big changes, because it'll just add to any sort of anxiety or depressive symptoms they may be already experiencing. Be certain that there's time to grieve. Be aware, in particular, and this can happen with anyone, anniversaries and holidays, even if they're not overtly aware of something that happened a few years ago, like this is the day of, well, XYZ of the loss, then you can kind of see a change in mood and temperament, that sort of things. Make sure that they're aware that they're aware of when grieving reactions are beyond the bounds of a normal grief reaction, in which case there might be some other sort of interventions that might be useful. Support groups are pretty important, a sense of universality that other people experience the same sorts of things, and even getting feedback from those folks about how they were able to cope. Divorce and separation is a loss on many levels, and it's important to know that nearly 40% of children from divorced households end up in poverty. So there are lots of impacts that occur after divorce, and it's not just the emotional loss or the physical loss of a person, but there are economic ties, housing changes, school changes, all kinds of things that occur after divorce and separation. Oh, and the wonderful thing is about 50% of marriages end in divorce, but then it gets even higher, like second marriages or something like 75%. It just, kind of snowballs after that. So we talked a little bit about there may be loss of financial status and social networks. Also, if there's like a new family system or even the absence of family systems, there can be changes in rules and roles in the family system. And that's where like some of this family theory practice comes into play and thinking about family systems theory. Um, we know that men tend to have more difficulty in recovering than women, and you'll see higher risk of suicide after divorce and separation. Higher, in particular, I think, with men in terms of actual uh, committal and execution of the suicide. Poor choice of words there. So, intervention, the goal is to help the client grieve. There are a few ways to do this. We talked about support groups, journaling, reading, normalizing. It's a part of life, educating about services that are out there, what's normative, when to keep an eye out on things when they're not. About a quarter of children live with a divorced parent. The custodial parent's own adjustment is a best predictor of the child adjustment. When it comes to divorce, too, one of the other indicators is how well the divorced parents get along post divorce. If they can be civil and friendly and collaborate, the child tends to have a better quality of life projection as opposed to those who are in bitter custody fights and arguing, especially in front of the kid, and saying things to each other about each other to the kid. There can be physical aggression um, with the kids in terms of their reaction, anger, hostility. And also, you'll see massive changes if there's another change in the family system where there's a blended family system where the child isn't sure who they should be loyal to. And maybe if they become close with a step parent, they may feel bad about that. There could be ongoing struggles between the parents that separated. Another one is job loss, where uh, you can see high rates, especially the older someone is, higher rates of emotional impacts, I think. It can lead to depression, low satisfaction with life, health consequences, and also when you lose something that defines you, when you lose that aspect of it, it's like losing a part of yourself, right? Like, how do I define myself if I'm not doing this particular work that I've done for a while now? Usually, those with more support in higher education feel they have more control and can kind of get through this a little bit easier. But also, losing one's job can impact your role, it can impact your prestige, it can impact your social status. Interventions around this, of course, validation, important for all these, validating the challenge in finding new employment, um, making sure that they have access to unemployment benefits, if you have to find any sort of housing or any other economic uh, instances where you got to kind of step it up as a case manager, or in particular if you're not used to dealing with the economic side of things, just to make sure that they have the safety nets involved, so that they can have a better chance of bouncing back. So that requires that you learn how to navigate financial assistance resources, help them. You may have to be an advocate at schools or things like that to try to make sure that their kids can get in. Um, so it can take more of an active approach on the part of the cases crisis intervention worker. I haven't had my toast yet, so it just rang, so I'm going to have it. And this is the end of the lecture. All right.